Our session today is on authoritarian innovations in labour governance, and it's been organised by Michael Gillan. And we cover 5 countries in this session: the USA, Mexico, Poland, India and Myanmar. And this panel is actually a part of a special issue that Michael and Michelle Ford, who's not here unfortunately today, are guest editing for the Journal of Industrial Relations. So let me hand over to Michael now, who's going to speak to us. He's going to set the context for this session. Michael is going to talk to us about authoritarian innovations, a fresh perspective on the state's role in labour governance. This is co-authored with Michelle, of course, who's not here. And Michael is an associate professor at the University of Western Australia Business School in Perth. His current research interests encompass global union federations, transnational labour regulation, and state governance and labour movements in Asia. He is a co-chief investigator on an Australian Research Council discovery grant on global production networks and worker representation in Myanmar, and is a board member of RC44 labour movements in the ISA, which is the International Sociological Association. And as I already mentioned, Michael and Michelle together are guest editing the forthcoming special issue of the JIR on authoritarian innovations in labour governance. So over to Michael.
Thank you, Premilla. Thank you so much for that kind introduction and also for setting the scene a little bit. I'll just say a few remarks that basically provide a background to both this panel and also the forthcoming special issue of the Journal of Industrial Relations, which Premilla mentioned that I'm a guest editor of, along with Michelle Ford from the University of Sydney. Now, the background to all of this is that in 2021, I co-authored a paper along with Michelle Ford and Christy Ward from the University of Sydney that was published in the journal Governance, and the paper was titled Authoritarian Innovations in Labour Governance, the Case of Cambodia. And in this paper, we sought to understand how labour rights and democratic voice in Cambodia will roll back over a series of years, not by using the kind of predictable authoritarian techniques that we normally think about as being associated with authoritarian regimes, that is violence and coercion, but by a series of gradual adjustments to industrial relations institutions and a re-engineering of bureaucratic procedures. And in the paper, we basically describe this as happening, but also explain why this happened insofar as in Cambodia, and particularly in the context of the importance of the garment manufacturing industry in that country, it's quite important for them to have at least a veneer of international legitimacy and to a certain extent domestic legitimacy as well in terms of the enactment of governance. So it was necessary for the ruling party and the state in Cambodia to basically demobilise what was becoming quite an insurgent labour movement, and one that they were concerned about developing links with political opposition groups, but they had to demobilise and disable it in ways that were more subtle than the usual techniques of just arrests, violence and coercion. So the necessity was to do this through incremental changes to institutions, to practices, to basically the function of the bureaucracy to disable labour voice. So I won't go into the details of that paper here because it will take all my time up. But clearly, by the title of our paper, we actually used a conceptual lens to interpret the country case of Cambodia of authoritarian innovations. And this idea comes out of the political science literature, and particularly comes out of political science scholars who are especially interested in processes around democratisation. And increasingly also its flip side, how democracy is disabled and disempowered and dismantled. It especially drew upon a special collection of a series of articles that were published in the journal Democratisation in 2020, and a framing article by the editors of that special collection, Nicole Curato and Diego Fossati, who had this framing article, Authoritarian Innovations, Crafting Support for a Less Democratic Southeast Asia. Now, Curato and Fossati in this paper, setting the scene for this notion, this idea of authoritarian innovations, define this term as, quote, novel governance practices designed to shrink spaces for meaningful public participation in politics. Other authors in the issue went on to describe authoritarian innovations in the sense of a quite broad range of a menu of options of governance practices that can be deployed at a meso level that actually restrict democratic space, accountability and independent voice. And these can include regulatory changes, the strategic use of legal action, adjustments of bureaucratic procedures, new forms of public communication strategies and many other means. As Curato and Fossati went on to explain, and this is a quote, actors pursuing autocratic agendas creatively employ a variety of tools to debilitate democracy while maintaining or creating nominally democratic institutions. And this can be observed, they argued, across both authoritarian regimes and democracies alike. Even governments and leaders that have been democratically elected may be, quote, innovating to shrink spaces for voice and accountability. Now, we thought and still think that this concept is potentially useful to employment relations and labour relations scholars because of its meso-level attention to practices that disable or subvert democratic participation and voice. And clearly our interest is how that pertains to the field of labour governance. But also that it can be applied across a range of different macro-level political regime and country context types. And this could range from established democracies to one-party states to hybrid regimes. So when we were looking at Cambodia, we're clearly looking at a country that at one time was seen as a little bit of a hybrid regime, is now seen as moving closer towards harder form of authoritarian one-party state rule. But it's in a macro level, we have that regime. But what intrigued us is, well, potentially this is a concept that could be deployed across a range of country contexts in the sense of at a meso level, thinking about what are the practices that actually disable labour voice and actually, in a sense, unwind democracy and opportunities for democratic participation. The proponents of this concept by authoritarian innovations, I should say, have drawn heavily on the foundational work of the political scientist Marlies Glassius. Now, Glassius wrote a paper in 2018 on authoritarian practices, which has been quite influential in political science. And Glassius, she has followed this up by producing a book in 2023, Authoritarian Practices in a Global Age, which has been published by Oxford University Press. Glassius has argued that the political science field, when it discusses authoritarian governance, has overly focused on the classification of political regime types at the macro level, the characters of dominant political leaders, and the conduct and outcomes of elections. As a consequence of this narrow focus, she's argued, the actual practices and actions taken to diminish democratic space at other levels of governance often go unobserved. Now, that doesn't mean that Glassius is saying the macro doesn't matter. Anyone who watched the presidential debate last night probably woke up this morning with sweaty palms and feeling slightly nauseous. That's how I felt, and I'm not American. But the point here is just exclusively thinking about democracy and authoritarianism at the level of elections, populist political leaders, actually is missing in many ways the unwinding, the dismantling of democratic space in other fields and levels of governance. Glassius also draws attention, of course, to authoritarian practices that emanate from and via the state, but also draws attention to looking beyond the state in terms of, collaborations between the state and private sector actors, or even with civil society, or authoritarian practices that actually emanate from civil society itself. The literature on authoritarian innovations builds on this intellectual foundation. However, its proponents also draw attention to the idea of innovation, insofar as new authoritarian practices may be created or existing practices reconfigured and assembled in new ways, in ways that actually reduce democratic voice and accountability. Another distinctive feature of the approach is its observation that authoritarian innovations, quote, draw from democratic discourse and disguise themselves as democratic in ways designed to build legitimacy and neutralise opposition. In short, a fundamental characteristic of these innovations is the fact that they cloak themselves in democratic values and institutions, while at the very same time eroding the voice and limiting genuine democratic participation. Now, in our field, there's always been interest in the enabling conditions that support worker voice and participation, and obviously an emphasis on the role of genuine and independent collective representation, typically in the form of trade unions, in the workplace and in the broader society. When you think about this idea of authoritarian innovations in the political science literature, it does in some ways is an inversion of a already existing interest for those scholars in what was formerly referred to as democratic innovations. And democratic innovations are practices and reforms that deepen democracy, that sustain democracy. So the authoritarian innovation school, if I can call it that, basically turn that on its head and say, we can look at that, but let's also think about practices that disable democracy, that weaken democracy, that actually sabotage the demand for accountability. And in our field, we think there's also a space for closer observation of practices that disable and disempower worker voice, accountability and participation in and beyond the workplace, particularly when these things can be subtle, gradual, or, as I said before, disguise themselves in ways that look as if they are actually legitimate or well-intentioned. Based on these considerations, we define authoritarian innovations in the labour-industrial relations field as new governance practices that appear to advance labour rights, or at least be minimally compatible with labour rights, but in fact weaken or subvert labour's genuine democratic participation in the workplace, in institutions and in the broader polity. Here we are especially interested in how policy innovations or institutional change invoke the language of rights, of democracy, or even of freedoms to subvert genuine democratic participation in labour governance. We also recognise, however, that these authoritarian innovations are contested and challenged by labour movements and their allies, and we think that in these processes of contestation there's probably a lot to learn about the dynamics of industrial relations in specific country contexts. And that's what my fellow presenters will be talking about, so I'll leave it there. I am happy to talk about the Myanmar case in question times if people are interested in the paper contribution that Michelle and I have written on Myanmar. Thank you.
I just speak from here to introduce the next speaker. So our next speaker is Professor Chris Rhomberg, and he is going to speak about authoritarian innovation in the United States, the role of dual subnational systems of labour governance. And just by way of introduction, Chris Rhomberg is Professor of Sociology at Fordham University in New York City. He has published internationally on historical and contemporary issues in American labour relations, including strikes, collective bargaining and labour law, workers in media and in low-wage industries, and current economic and political junctures in the US. His book, The Broken Table, The Detroit Newspaper Strike and the State of American Labor, received the 2013 award for the best book on labor and labor movements from the American Sociological Association.
I'd like to thank Michael for organizing this session and all my fellow panelists and everybody here for coming, so thank you very much. Michael's already introduced the concept of authoritarian innovation and particularly the role of unions and worker voice, especially for democracy. So building on that, I want to emphasize that this analysis also stresses that these relations are mediated by power relations among different actors in meso-level institutional arenas, as you mentioned, specifically what we could call labor regimes. In the U.S., then, the role of national institutions like Congress, the National Labor Relations Board, and the federal courts are all very important. But my focus here is going to be on a less prominent but crucial arena under American federalism, which is state governments and their labor and welfare policies. So I examine trends and processes that emerged long before the election of Donald Trump as president in 2016. To analyze the labor regimes, then, I draw my analytic approach from the varieties of capitalism and power resource theory schools. Right? From the VOC, I take labor regimes are part of a broad set of laws and institutions that correspond to models of economic development and that shape active formation and strategies. These are path-dependent processes that reinforce then institutional differences. The VOC has to highlight the role of employers. For me, I think that's very important, but they're not as the central actors, but in relation to other actors. From the PRT, then, I take that institutions are not the product of equilibria, but of contested struggles over distribution, social reproduction, and the model or path of development. The PRT, as many of us know, then looks at the power resources of conflicting interests, right, and focuses particularly on a working class organization. So regimes are distinguished not by a fixed set of policies or spatial boundaries, but by opposing institutional logics. In this case, then, the contrast between neoliberal markets and New Deal social citizenship, or the legacy of that. So if we apply this at a subnational level in the United States, right, I argue that since the 1930s, the U.S. has had not one national labor regime, but two competing subnational regimes. The New Deal in the North and West Coast regions, and a counter regime based initially in the former Confederate Southern states. The Southern regime historically has had more restrictive labor laws, weaker welfare, and a legacy of authoritarian politics. It gained national ascendancy in the 1980s and 90s with the rise of neoliberalism, and in the 2010s, it expanded its boundaries into the deindustrialized Midwestern states. Now, historians have shown how the New Deal coalition in the 1930s, depended upon Southern Democrats representing a regional, agrarian, and low-wage economy within a racist, authoritarian, one-party political system. Southern elites demanded exceptions to the New Deal in order to keep paternalist control over their dependent labor forces, especially in the production of cotton and textiles. Thus, the 1935 National Labor Relations Act and the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act both excluded agricultural and domestic work, then the largest sectors employing African Americans. The NLRA mandated no permanent national or sectoral bargaining. We know the bargaining is at the firm level, local level, thereby allowing firms to relocate from the north to the south to avoid unions. The NLRA also excluded the public sector, where unions would emerge only decades later under highly variable state laws. Southern Democrats also backed the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, right, which among other things, allowed states to impose quote-unquote right-to-work laws that undermine union resources by allowing workers to free ride on union gains. Several southern states already had right to work actually before 1947, but with the passage of Taft-Hartley, then virtually all of them did. By 1954, 10 of the 11 former Confederate states had passed right to work. A lot has changed since then, obviously. During the post-war period and after, then with the mechanization of agriculture and under the New Deal reforms, Southern landowners quickly abandoned labor paternalism and now sought to expel their surplus farm black and poor populations. In the textile mill villages, factory owners cut costs and sold off company housing to employees. In the 1960s and 70s, there was the mass civil rights movement in the South, the end of legal segregation, and now federal protection for black voting rights. The Great Society era of the 1960s then also brought other advances on the New Deal path, including Medicare and Medicaid, an expansion of welfare, and the minimum wage. The era also saw then the rise of public sector unions in some states, but not others. By 1980, then, what is strange is that some observers still expected Southern modernization to lead to its assimilation into the Northern New Deal order. That didn't quite happen. The Southern labor regime largely endured. Southern states avoided legalizing most collective sector bargaining, and union density, wages, and welfare are still lower today in the South than in the North, creating a competitive downward pressure, but not a national equilibrium. What I argue is what instead, on the contrary, is that there are these dual regimes. Now, the dual regimes represent opposing models of development. Backed by federal military spending, Southern economic growth coincided with the rise of neoliberalism. The region had long relied on outside capital, and with globalization, local elites promoted the region as an anti-union, low-tax, and deregulatory haven for European and Asian manufacturers in chemicals, auto, and aerospace. So that today, the American auto industry, for example, now has two industrial complexes governed by different regimes. There's the cluster of unionized firms historically located in American Midwestern states, and a newer complex in the South led by German, Japanese, and Korean firms lured by generous state tax breaks and virtually all non-union. The region remains strongly resistant to unions, led not just by employers, but political elites, defending Southern development model and labor regime. I can say more about that later. Now, in the 2010s, then, the Southern regime expanded its boundaries into the deindustrialized Midwest. The Supreme Court ruled in 2010 that political campaign finance limits violated corporations' freedom of speech. Wealthy business groups then immediately poured money into state elections, and Republicans gained control in Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, and quickly began attacking unions and workers' rights. In 2011, Wisconsin passed legislation that virtually eliminated collective bargaining for approximately 175,000 state workers. Within 5 years, 15 states had passed new restrictions on public sector unions, and between 2012 and 2017, Indiana, Michigan, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and Kentucky all adopted right to work. These policy shifts were justified essentially by reactionary populism, right? Using a neoliberal rhetoric of individual rights, relief for working taxpayers, job growth, and antagonism to outgrowths like racial minorities and immigrants. Yet they were also still contested. Ohio passed restrictions on public sector unions in 2011, and Missouri passed right to work in 2017, but union-led coalitions mobilized ballot referenda that overturned them by landslide margins. Well, what are the implications for authoritarian innovation? Well, my main contribution here is to call attention to subnational labor regimes. Under American federalism, we see systemic differences in state policies, including rights to unionize, state regulation of employment conditions, and public provision for worker subsistence, including things like unemployment insurance and cash assistance for the poor. So what we have then are competing dual regimes that feature divergent paths and opposing institutional logics. The Southern regime is historically anti-union, anti-welfare, and anti-democratic. So there is not an equilibrium, but a shifting boundaries between regimes, especially in contested and battleground states. The dual regime rivalry then has reduced the space for democratic governance of employment, stymied union organization, and led to a diminished capacity of working class actors to counter rising authoritarianism in politics and society. So the theme of this panel then, I think, is that struggles over labor regimes are in fact struggles over democracy.
Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. We now have Adam Mrozowicki, who is going to talk to us about authoritarian innovations in Polish industrial relations, from liberal to illiberal illusory corporatism. And Adam is an associate professor at the Institute of Sociology, University of Wroclaw, and currently also a Fulbright visiting scholar at the IIMA School at Fordham University. His research interests include the sociology of work, economic sociology, comparative industrial relations, and his recent research concerns precarity and essential worker coping strategies with interlinked crises. His research has been published in various academic journals, including most recently in Sociology, WES, Work Employment and Society, Employee Relations, and the International Labour Review. He's also a member of the editorial boards of the Sociological Review and Transfer, European Review of Labour and Research. So over to you, and I hope I pronounced your surname correctly. I hope.
Very good, thank you. Thank you very much, colleagues, for coming, and thank you for this very kind introduction. So, what I would like to present you is the story of authoritarian innovations in the Polish industrial relations, and the title is supplemented by the subtitle From Liberal to Illiberal Illusory Corporatism, and I'm very happy that the author of the concept of illusory corporatism is with us here, because it's David Oss, who is just sitting here in the audience. So, and I had no chance to hear his feedback to this paper, so it would be actually quite good to have direct discussion with the author of the content and all of you. My contribution addresses the problem of authoritarian innovations in labor governance in Poland, and unlike most studies that analyze authoritarian practices since the right-wing Law and Justice Party, Poland in 2015-2023, I took a longer historical perspective in my analysis, and I'm drawing from Oss' thesis of illusory corporatism, and argue that a fundamental element of neoliberal transformation in Poland after 1989 was the introduction of weak tripartite institutions used to suppress social conflicts while complying with international standards. I draw my analysis from secondary data and 37 expert interviews with social partners collected in 2016 and 2021 within 2 projects to explore the role of authoritarian innovations in managing 2 crises, global financial crisis in 2008 plus and COVID-19 pandemic. And I see the contribution of this paper as a contribution to the literature on crisis, corporatism, and competitive corporatism by exploring the role of institutional drift, so not changing institutions over time, keeping them as they were designed, in the evolution and transmutations and actually reproduction of illusory corporatism in Poland. And in terms of theoretical framework, I'm using the definition of authoritarian innovations which has been presented earlier, so hollowing out and reworking of labor institutions. And I assume that it can happen in various political regimes, so both democratic and non-democratic regimes. And in the paper, I built a link between authoritarian innovations and debates on the nature of evolution and evolution of corporatism. Assuming, in line with the existing literature, that a part of corporatism has been always a pacification of workers' voice, some elements of workers' voice, and that this element has been particularly important in times of growing international global competition, pressure on labor standards, and this element can be found in a concept of competitive corporatism, crisis corporatism, which all refer to the changing functions of corporatism. So from securing some kind of equity to much more securing macroeconomic stability and national competitiveness. And this is very similar to what has been proposed by Oz in terms of the Eastern Europe, in fact, because his thesis is that the institutions which we know from the West, so for instance tripartite commissions, has been implemented there mainly to secure this competitiveness and to demonstrate to international community that we do have such kind of internationally recognized social dialogue institutions. And in fact, I think we can extend, and this is what I'm doing in the paper, this argument to other labor institutions, not just tripartite institutions, but the way how certain labor rights has been established in the early 90s was exactly done in a similar manner. So it both meant that they increased workers' voice in certain areas of life, but at the same time, they limited this voice, so workers could not threaten the process of neoliberal transition. And I'm arguing that this is slightly different from what Vaccaro and Howell described in terms of conversion, of institutional conversion, which accompanied the creation of these new versions of corporatism in Western Europe, because conversion meant that institutions change their functions over time. While what I'm claiming, that they actually were designed as weak institutions from the very beginning. So this is the main difference which I'm seeing between West and the East. And I'm about to finish, so that's another thing. But I'm basically trying to demonstrate in the paper the developments of those core labor institutions over time, starting from the early 90s, and I'm look closely at right to join and form pluralistic unions, right to strike and collective dispute resolution mechanism, right to collectively bargain, and tripartite social dialogue. And I'm showing that in all cases, they basically acted in double way. So they enabled workers' voice, but at the same time, they constrained it in a way which, for instance, when you think about the right to strike, basically blocked the capacity of organizing legal strikes in many sectors. Because you had to have very strict referendums of the strike rules of the strike ballots, which workers had to obey. And then looking closer at the two crises, so 2008 plus crisis and pandemic, I demonstrate that the way of using labor institutions by liberal government and illiberal government. Liberal government was in place in 2008. It was a civic platform government with the Polish People's Party, which is a kind of centrist coalition, centrist liberal coalition. And then the Law and Justice Party in 2020. So the way of using those labor institutions during crisis was pretty similar. So basically, government tried to show that they are using social dialogue, that they are referring to social to design and implement anti-crisis measures. But how they did it, in fact, meant that the dialogue has not been used or the resolutions has not been implemented. So it was more kind of PR corporatist, to use another term which was in the circulation. And what was the main novelty introduced by the Law and Justice in 2015, after 2015, was that they institutionalized much more stronger the relation with one of the main Polish trade unions, so Solidarity trade union. And this institutionalization, which was an authoritarian innovation in itself, I argue in the paper, was also a way of protecting this illiberal regime, which was between 2015 and 2023, from turning into even more authoritarian in labor relations. So in a sense, Solidarity acted as a way of supporting institutional drift of the regime without much changes in this particular area. That's my 8 minutes. So this is just conclusion. So what I find particularly striking in the Polish case is that as compared to many other areas of social life, such as media, courts, educational institutions, were really under assault of authoritarian government after 2015, labor relations have not changed much. They remained resilient. They remained as dysfunctional as they were before, basically speaking. So in a sense, most of the authoritarian innovations happened before 2015. That's the one point. Second, when government tried to introduce some specific authoritarian innovations, such as limiting social dialogue, council autonomy, or limiting the right to strike, unions in Solidarity opposed them. Also, by the way, also employers' associations opposed those changes. And then the Solidarity special role is particularly striking here. So the Solidarity Union special role is particularly striking because it acted as both element of authoritarian innovation, important aspect of authoritarian innovations, but also as a force which blocked other authoritarian innovations and which made the regime to reproduce itself. Yes. So addressing this question mark in my title, I think we can safely say that there is not much difference between liberal and illiberal variant of illusory corporatism in Poland, but there is much more continuity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. And now we have Ernesto Noronha, who is going to talk about the interface between authoritarian innovation and labor implications for the Indian workforce. I happen to be a co-author on that paper as well. And Ernesto Noronha is Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, India. His research interests include employment relations and globalization, workplace dignity, technology and work, workplace diversity and workplace bullying. Ernesto has published in peer-reviewed international journals such as the Journal of Business Ethics, Industrial and Labor Relations Review, Information and Organization, Journal of Contemporary Asia, and International Journal of Human Resource Management. He's currently section editor of Labor Relations and Business Ethics in the Journal of Business Ethics and a board member of the International Visual Sociology Association. So over to you.
So I will not be giving a theoretical framework because Michael's already done it. I'll go straight away into the Indian context and how authoritarian innovations are playing out in the Indian context, especially after the Modi government took over in 2014. Now, when the Modi government took over in 2014, it has been employing certain strategies in terms of, changing labor laws and labor rights. So there are 4 strategies that it's employed. One is use of discourse. The second is the change has happened, as Michael has said earlier. It's a very gradual process of change. The third strategy is to disengage with the unions. And finally, the fourth is to split unions and to implement its own labor agenda. Now, with regard to the issue of discourse, it often uses the decolonization discourse by saying that the labor laws that were, labor laws are outdated and they were enacted in the British era, and therefore they need to be changed. Now, when talking to unions, basically they say, union leaders, they say that, the labor codes that are being passed by Parliament without any dialogue are actually regressive, and they make employment precarious. For example, the Labour Code on Industrial Relations talks about fixed-term employment. Now, this when you introduce fixed-term employment, which is for a year, naturally employment becomes precarious. They also talk about increasing the threshold limits. For example, if you had to retrench, dismiss, or lay off workers initially under the Industrial Dispute Act, the current Industrial Dispute Act, you had to take, if you employ more than 100 workers, you had to take permission of the government to dismiss, retrench, or lay off. Now this has been increased, this limit has been raised to 300. Okay, so if organizations employ less than 300, they do not need to take permission of the government. So this discourse of decolonization basically is resulting in increased precariousness for workers. The other discourse that Prime Minister Modi is often resorts to is the whole thing of Hindu nationalist discourse, which basically where he's talking about workers being Rashtra Nirmata. Rashtra Nirmata basically means nation builders. At the same time, he introduces the concept or introduces this program which is called Shrameva Jayate. Now, Shrameva Jayate basically means hail labor, but the program basically is meant to dismantle the inspection of the labor system, okay, the inspectorate. Okay, so it is in a way, though the discourse, through discourse or through play of discourse, he tries to, sell this idea that the changes that he's bringing to the labor legislation is in favor of labor. Okay, that's the discourse thing. Then he's also introducing changes in the labor legislation in a very gradual way. Though you see that he's making changes in the labor laws at the central level, as compared to the earlier governments which left it to the states, but it is done in a gradual way. For example, they had come up with this bill of small factories bill in 2014, which basically meant that factories which employ less than 40 workers would be exempt from 14 labor laws, which includes the Industrial Dispute Act, Factories Act, the Payment of Wages Act, and the Employment Provident Fund Act. Now, this was then really not implemented and was abandoned in 2018. Then they also introduced the Essential Defense Services Act, okay, which basically restricts the right to strike of defense workers. Now, this act was basically in operation for only a year. But many provisions of these acts have now come into the Industrial Relations Code, which was passed by Parliament, as I said earlier, without any debate, okay, in 2020. Now, so under the Industrial Relations Code, basically the right to strike is almost gone, because if you have to strike now under the Industrial Relations Code, you have to give a notice of strike. And when there's a dispute, it goes to conciliation. And during conciliation, if you strike, the strike becomes illegal. Now, if the strike is illegal, there's a possibility of unions getting deregistered. So as a result of this, the union leaders often say that union recognition, which is provided in the Industrial Relations Code, which was one of the major problems in industrial relations of India, becomes redundant. Okay, because if you don't have a right to strike, then union recognition is of no use. Okay, then the third strategy basically is disengaging with unions. For example, the Indian Labour Conference was basically held every year, but since 2015, he's not held any Indian Labour Conference. This was a Labour Conference where you actually discuss labour policy. Okay, so since 2015, it's not been held. And also the labour codes, which I said was passed in Parliament in 2020 and 2019, they were not discussed with labour leaders, and their objections were not taken on board at all. Okay. Besides that, NGOs working with labor, some of their licenses have been cancelled under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. Finally, he also since Convention 130 basically says that you have to consult with unions and civil society organizations. What the Modi government basically has done is split the unions. For example, the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, which is affiliated to the Bharatiya Janata Party, which Modi leads, basically. Okay, so that union has withdrawn from the Coordination Committee of the Central Trade Unions, which was a body of all the central trade unions which generally took up issues against privatization. and a neoliberalization. Okay. In fact, what has happened is that the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, which is affiliated to the BJP, has formed this confederation of central trade unions. So in a way, the union has been split. Now the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, or the BMS, has been rewarded in various ways by the government. And for example, one of the rewards that it got was appointment of the chair of the L20 when the G20 summit was held in India in 2023. Normally, what used to happen is the International Trade Union Confederation used to chair, or the affiliates of the International Trade Union Confederation used to chair these L20 summits wherever they were held in the rest of the world. But this time the government said that only BMS can chair this L20 summit. And that's one of the rewards it had from the government of the BJP government or the Modi government. Besides that, the Modi government has also tried to, exclude unions who are affiliated to the opposition parties. So, for example, when the Central Board of Trustees this is very recent, last 2-3 months, was reconstituted of the EPFO, that is the Employment Provident Fund Organization, was reconstituted. The opposition affiliated unions were excluded from the Central Board of Trustees. So if you look at it, there is shrinking, spaces for workers' voice in India. And the Modi government basically has used discourse, has done it in a very gradual way, and has disengaged with the unions, and also split unions to show that it believes in consultation. I'll stop here. Thanks.
So we have our last speaker, and that's Cirila Quintero Ramírez. She's going to talk about between labor control and worker empowerment, authoritarian innovations and demographic reforms in Mexico. She has her co-authors, that's Mark Arner and Matthew Fisher-Daly. Is any person here? All right, and I'll just introduce Cirila. So Cirila Quintero Ramírez has a PhD in sociology from El Colegio de Mexico. I hope I said that correctly. She's a full-time professor and researcher of El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, which is Border Studies Institute, Campus Matamoros. Her research areas are unions, gender and migration in the north of Mexico. She's the author and co-editor of several books, the most recent being Unions, Workers and Activists on the North of Mexico, which is in Spanish. She's been a visiting professor at universities in Canada, Sweden, Spain, and the US, and is participating in the collective project Enforcement of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement Rapid Response Mechanism, views from the Mexican auto sector workers in Cornell University. And she's preparing a new project about workers and labor conflicts during the UCMCA, which is the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you to Michael to organize this panel. This paper is about the one collaboration with Mark Arner and Matthew Fisher, and we are analyzing about the case of the Mexico. In this moment, I would like to say that we have 3 objectives in this chapter. First, we analyze about the authoritarian innovation in Mexico in this moment, because in 2018 we have one change in the labor, especially the Mexican government want to support the democratization and also the collective bargaining in Mexico. And second, but what happened in Mexico? The outcome was missed. Yes, we have one open possibilities to the workers, but also the state have another ways to control. This is very important. The discussion is followed to the Professor Chris about the contradiction between federal and local and state level. And also we are using 3 cases to show what is happening in Mexico. These cases are linking with the international level. Especially, we are speaking about the 3 cases in Mexico. One case is in the agro industry in Baja California, where the workers want to look for a new union, but a lot of the instances in the government prohibited to recognition of this new union. And the second part is about one very famous case in Mexico, BU Manufacturing. It was one case on the north of Mexico where they wanted support of the mechanism of the IIMA, but finally also was a debate when it was no win in this case. And finally, we are speaking about another plant in Mexico and on the north in my town. It's Matamoros, and it's about a big movement. Want to choose a new union, but finally the power of the local union don't allow to have a new union. This is the case is Mexico. In the west is in San Quintin, the agro industry. In the east is BU Manufacturing, and in the coast is Matamoros. I am living here. Well, how about authoritarian innovation in this case? Well, the three cases show the 3 points. Freedom, yes. We have freedom to organize in a union. And also we want to respect to the collective bargain, but we have a very important bureaucratic control about the unions, about the collective bargain, including with the new institution is very controlled with the workers. And the second, yes, we have the workers have different resources to demand to the companies that are not respectful of the labor rights, but the better on this protection is excluded different sectors, like agro-industry. Agro-industry is not inside of this protection. The most important in Uzbeka was the auto workers, auto sector. And third, and also, yes, support to organize to independent unions, but the procedure is controlled for the official union. This is very important. What is the change? And also, I guess, and we believe that it's very important, yes, to have federal laws, but also it's important to have regional laws and the regional supervisor to see what is happening in the local and the state level. What believe that we are the contribution to this concept? Well, first, we say that the authoritarian innovation is a concept very adaptive, very, very, very important, because you can to use this concept to study different sectors and different countries or regions, and also because also you have one possibility to analyze the different political system, economic systems. And also we want that also that this concept is important because you allow to analyze different ways to contestation of the workers. You can need no monolithic concept. It's very rich to analyze different space. And also, finally, with this concept, we can to show different levels of the governance in the level and the local and in the middle, and also in the federal level. This is one scheme that illustrated that the say in the past. What is the conclusion for us? First, I guess we demonstrate the operation of this authoritarian innovation have different response. Yes, you empower to the workers, but you control. this is the ambiguous, Mr. And also, I guess for Mexico is very important because, yes, you want to democratize to the unions, but you continue with the low cost of the workers. And also, how do you democratize if you have low wage and also non-independent unions? And second, and also I guess there is this action of the Mexican government to ambiguous behavior to support and to control, don't limit a lot to the workers to improve. Limit because it's yes, you have a new institutions, but you are controlled both for the managers and also for the all unions at the new institution. And finally, I guess, in spite of this control, the workers continue to contest it. The workers is saying to Mexican government, you tell me I have a right to democracy, then you give me. This is the worker demanding. Thank you.